The flight had started just like any other. The passengers of Flight 347 settled into their seats as the plane climbed steadily into the sky, leaving behind the bustling city below. Luggage was stowed, seatbelts clicked, and murmured conversations filled the air as people adjusted their headrests, skimmed through the in-flight magazine, or stared absent-mindedly at the small screens embedded in the seats ahead. For a while, it was just another routine flight, another passage through the clouds where nothing unusual was supposed to happen. And then it did. It started with a simple request, one that, on any other day, would have been handled with nothing more than a polite nod. Ethan Carter, a middle-aged businessman, had approached a flight attendant named Samantha Lowe regarding his seat. He had received an incorrect seat assignment, one that placed him between two passengers instead of the window seat he had originally booked. A minor inconvenience, perhaps, but after a long and exhausting business trip, Ethan simply wanted to rest. "Excuse me, miss," he had said, his voice calm but firm. "I believe there's been a mistake with my seat. I booked a window, but I was assigned something different. Is there any way to switch?" Samantha had been busy, far busier than usual. The airline was short-staffed, and she had spent the past 2 hours handling a series of demanding passengers, each one stretching her patience thinner and thinner. She barely glanced at Ethan before responding. "All seats are assigned at check-in," she said quickly, not bothering to check the manifest. "You'll have to take it up with the gate agent next time." Ethan frowned, his brows drawing together. He wasn't one to cause trouble, but the dismissal in her voice didn't sit well with him. "I understand, but I checked in early and chose my seat in advance. Could you take a look at the seating chart? Maybe there's an open window seat available." This time, Samantha's eyes flickered toward him with unmistakable irritation. The exhaustion in her body was beginning to boil over. She had already dealt with 2 delayed flights today, a spilled tray of drinks, and a passenger who refused to wear his seatbelt during takeoff. She was tired, overworked, and underappreciated. "I told you," she repeated, her voice sharper this time. "There's nothing I can do. Please return to your seat." The tone in her voice caught the attention of nearby passengers. Some turned their heads slightly, ears perking up at the tension in the air. Ethan exhaled slowly, trying to keep his patience in check. "With all due respect," he said, still attempting to be diplomatic, "I don't think it's unreasonable to ask you to check. I'd appreciate a little help here." And then it happened. Something inside Samantha snapped. It was a fraction of a second, a sudden rush of heat that overrode every ounce of self-control she had left. Without thinking, she raised her hand and struck him across the face. The sharp crack of the slap rang out across the cabin like a gunshot, silencing every conversation, every rustle of fabric, every click of a seatbelt. Time seemed to freeze. Passengers sat in stunned silence, their eyes wide with disbelief. Ethan staggered slightly, his hand flying to his cheek, his skin stinging from the force of the blow. For a moment, no one moved. Then a collective gasp spread through the cabin like a ripple across a still pond. A woman in the row across from them clapped her hands over her mouth. A man seated behind Ethan muttered, "Did that just happen?" to no one in particular. Samantha's breath hitched. The realization of what she had just done crashed into her like a tidal wave. Her palms still burned from the contact, her fingers trembling slightly as they curled into a fist. The heat of her anger had disappeared, replaced by a horrifying, sinking dread. Ethan didn't say a word at first. He simply stared at her, his dark eyes searching her face for some kind of explanation, some justification for what had just happened. But there was none. Samantha swallowed hard. "Oh, God. She started, her voice barely above a whisper. The silence in the plane had turned unbearable, thick and suffocating. Every single passenger was watching. The flight crew stood frozen near the galley, unsure of what to do next. The weight of their gazes crushed her. Ethan's voice, when he finally spoke, was eerily controlled. "I need to speak to your supervisor," he said, his voice devoid of the warmth it had carried before. His words were not shouted, nor were they filled with anger, but they were dangerous. Samantha's stomach clenched. A security issue. That's what this was now. No matter how exhausted, no matter how frustrated she had been, she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispering in hushed tones. One of them, a woman in a navy blazer, pulled out her phone and started recording. Another flight attendant, Maya, quickly stepped forward, her face pale as she reached for Ethan's arm. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked gently. Ethan's jaw was tense, his fingers rubbing the red mark on his cheek. He nodded once, but his gaze remained fixed on Samantha. "Fine," he said, "but I expect this to be handled the moment we land." Samantha felt as though the air had been sucked out of the cabin. She wanted to apologize. She wanted to rewind time, to take back that moment of weakness, to shake herself out of whatever had caused her to snap. But there was no going back. This would not be ignored. This would not be something she could explain away. The airline had a zero-tolerance policy for aggression, and she had just broken it in the most public way possible. The seconds dragged by, but her fate had already been sealed. As the plane continued toward its destination, Samantha knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just an incident. This was the end of her career. Conclusion. The incident aboard Flight 347 was not just about a single act of aggression. It was a moment of complete loss of control, one that would have severe consequences for both the flight attendant and the airline. What should have been an ordinary flight turned into a breaking point, one that would shock the passengers, redefine the airline's policies, and change Samantha's life forever. But this was just the beginning. The fallout from that single slap would be far bigger than anyone on that plane could have imagined. The atmosphere inside Flight 347 had shifted from routine calm to an unbearable electric tension. The sharp slap that had echoed through the cabin moments ago now hung in the air like a phantom, its weight pressing on everyone who had witnessed it. The silence was deafening. Samantha Lowe, the flight attendant at the center of the storm, stood frozen in place. Her hand, the same hand that had just struck a passenger, felt like it no longer belonged to her. She wanted to take it back. She wanted to undo the moment that had shattered the order of the flight. But it was too late. Ethan Carter, the passenger who had been on the receiving end of the slap, was no longer sitting. He had risen from his seat slowly, deliberately, his expression an unreadable mask of shock and restrained fury. A crimson mark was beginning to bloom across his cheek, a stark and undeniable testament to what had just occurred. "I need to speak to your supervisor," he said finally, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a decision already made. Murmurs spread through the cabin like wildfire. Some passengers exchanged wide-eyed glances, while others pulled out their phones, whispering as they subtly recorded the aftermath. One woman in row 12 gasped, her fingers clutching her armrest as though the plane had suddenly hit turbulence. Samantha snapped out of her daze and took a step back. I didn't mean," she started, but the words died in her throat. What could she say? That she had lost control? That she had let frustration override years of training? It wouldn't matter. Nothing she said would matter now. Another flight attendant, Maya Rivera, stepped in hurriedly. Her brown eyes flickered between Ethan and Samantha, her usually composed expression now etched with quiet panic. "Sir," she said carefully, addressing Ethan, "please take a seat. I assure you we're going to handle this situation appropriately." Ethan didn't budge. His breathing was measured, controlled, but his patience had run out. "You'll handle it?" he asked, his voice still frighteningly calm. "You mean you'll sweep it under the rug? Pretend like it didn't happen?" Samantha's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. Everything was spiraling. Maya opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Ethan turned toward the nearest flight crew phone mounted to the wall. Without hesitation, he pressed the call button to the cockpit. Passengers stilled, their attention locked on him as though they were watching the climax of a movie. "This is Flight 347, he spoke into the phone. "There's been an incident. I'd like to report a physical assault by a crew member." Those words changed everything. Samantha felt the blood drain from her face. She had already crossed a line, but now the decision was no longer in her hands. The moment Ethan spoke to the captain, her fate had been sealed. Across the aisle, a man in his 50s, a lawyer by the look of him, leaned toward his wife and whispered, "She's finished." The flight crew, now fully aware of the severity of the situation, scrambled into action. Maya exchanged urgent glances with another attendant, Clark, who quickly disappeared toward the galley, no doubt contacting higher authorities. The rest of the flight was a slow, agonizing descent into the inevitable. Samantha didn't attempt to defend herself. What was the point? No one was looking at her as an employee anymore. She was the villain now. As the plane finally descended toward the airport, the tension only grew thicker. Passengers remained rigid in their seats, exchanging whispered theories on what would happen once they landed. Ethan never took his eyes off the front of the plane, his expression unreadable. Samantha had spent years working these flights, guiding passengers, handling turbulence, and responding to emergencies with grace. But this was an entirely different kind of turbulence, the kind that would ground her permanently. As the wheels hit the runway, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived at our destination. For those remaining on board after disembarkation, security will be present to assist with an ongoing matter." No further explanation. None was needed. As the plane taxied to the gate, Samantha felt the crushing weight of what was coming. The moment the seatbelt sign dinged off, passengers stood hurriedly, some eager to escape the uncomfortable scene they had just witnessed. Others, however, lingered, whispering to each other and stealing glances at Samantha as if she were a rare species they had never encountered before. But before anyone could leave, 3 uniformed security officers stepped on board. Every movement in the cabin halted. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered woman with short, dark hair, locked eyes with Samantha immediately. She stepped forward with a clipboard in hand, her tone firm but professional. "Samantha Lowe?" Samantha nodded slowly, her throat dry. "You need to come with us." The air was thick with tension. Samantha wished she could disappear, that she could wake up from this nightmare and return to a time before one single moment of anger had destroyed everything. As she gathered her things, the whispers turned into murmurs, the murmurs into quiet gasps. The flight crew averted their eyes, none of them willing to make direct contact with her. Ethan watched her the entire time, saying nothing. He didn't need to. As Samantha walked toward the exit, one of the security officers murmured into his radio, "We have her." And just like that, it was over. By the time they stepped into the jet bridge, the airline's senior supervisor was already waiting. A grim-faced woman in a dark blue blazer, her ID badge gleaming under the artificial airport lights. "Samantha," the woman said, her tone clipped. "Effective immediately, your employment with this airline is terminated." A pause. Passengers inside the plane craned their necks to see. Samantha swallowed the lump in her throat. "I understand." No protest, no plea for a second chance. She knew there would be none. And as she was led away, she didn't dare look back. Passengers would talk. Videos would go viral. Debates would erupt over whether the firing was fair or if there was more to the story. But one thing was certain, this was only the beginning of the fallout. Stay tuned, because what happened after this shocking firing was even more unexpected. The moment Samantha Lowe stepped off Flight 347, escorted by airport security, she felt the weight of every eye on her. It was as if the entire world had suddenly become a courtroom, and she was standing on trial before a jury of thousands of silent, judging faces. She had been fired on the spot. The airline had not asked for her side of the story. No warnings, no second chances. And within hours, the whole world knew about it. At first, she thought maybe, just maybe, the situation would fade away quietly. Maybe it would be just another airline incident, one that people gossiped about for a day or two before moving on to the next viral sensation. But she was wrong. The video started appearing online before she had even left the airport. Passengers had recorded the slap. Some had even live-streamed the aftermath. The footage spread like wildfire across Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. The captions were brutal. "Flight attendant loses control, slaps passenger mid-air. Unacceptable, passenger assaulted by airline staff. Outrage as flight attendant fired after shocking mid-flight attack." The more she scrolled, the worse it got. The story was everywhere. Every media outlet had picked it up, each one spinning it a little differently. Some sided with the airline, saying she had no excuse for her actions. Others questioned whether she had been pushed to her breaking point. Even Ethan Carter, the passenger she had slapped, had spoken to reporters. He didn't demand vengeance. He simply said that he was shocked and disappointed, that no passenger should be made to feel unsafe while flying. But his calm statement only fueled the outrage. Within 24 hours, the airline issued an official statement, defending her firing and reassuring passengers that they had a zero-tolerance policy for violence. "We do not condone physical altercations of any kind on board our aircraft. The safety and comfort of our passengers is our highest priority. For some, that was enough. They called for her to be blacklisted from working in the airline industry forever. Others dug through her past, trying to find any previous complaints or bad customer reviews, anything to paint her as a villain. But something unexpected started to happen. Not everyone saw Samantha as a monster. Some people started asking questions. Should she really have been fired so quickly? Shouldn't the airline have investigated first? Flight attendants deal with so much stress. How do we know she wasn't provoked? We don't condone violence, but why does it feel like she's being used as a scapegoat? Soon, a counter-narrative emerged. A small but growing group of supporters began pushing back against the idea that Samantha was simply an out-of-control employee who had deserved to be fired without question. And that's when the truth about her past began to surface. Samantha had been a flight attendant for nearly a decade. Her record? Flawless. Coworkers described her as one of the most patient, dedicated attendants on staff. She always stayed calm under pressure. Even when we had unruly passengers, she handled things with grace. A former colleague. I don't know what happened on that flight, but that's not the Samantha I worked with for years. A retired flight captain. Passengers who had flown with her before even began commenting online, recalling how she had helped calm a terrified child during turbulence, or how she had stayed behind to comfort an elderly man who had lost his wife and was flying alone for the first time in decades. A former passenger tweeted, "This is the same flight attendant who once sat with me after I had a panic attack mid-flight. She talked me through it and made sure I was okay the entire way." You're telling me she's a monster now? The more people learned about Samantha, the more sympathy grew. And then came the biggest revelation yet. Reports surfaced that she had been struggling with severe burnout. She had been working back-to-back shifts with little rest. In the 6 weeks leading up to the incident, she had worked an average of 14-hour days, often with only 1 day off per week. The mental and physical exhaustion had pushed her past her limit. She had been denied multiple requests for time off. Colleagues began speaking anonymously about the toxic work culture at the airline, describing how flight attendants were expected to be always perfect, no matter what. We're told to smile, even when passengers scream in our faces. We're told to stay calm, even when we're exhausted and running on fumes. And when one of us finally breaks under the pressure, we're thrown away like we never mattered. People began questioning everything. Was this really about Samantha losing control? Or was this about an airline that had ignored its employees until one of them finally cracked? By the end of the week, the entire conversation had shifted. Yes, Samantha had slapped a passenger. No one was excusing that. But now people were asking, why was she working 14-hour shifts with no breaks? Why did the airline fire her without hearing her side? How many other flight attendants were suffering in silence? A petition began circulating, demanding that the airline reconsider her termination. Within 48 hours, it had over 100,000 signatures. Even major news networks started running stories about the treatment of airline employees, shifting the focus from the slap itself to the industry-wide issue of burnout and mental health neglect. For the first time since the incident, Samantha felt something she hadn't expected. Hope. She had gone from being labeled a dangerous employee to a symbol of something much bigger. The airline had hoped to quietly fire her and move on, but now they were the ones under fire. And as Samantha sat in her tiny apartment, watching the news unfold, she realized her story wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. Would the airline reverse its decision? Would Samantha speak out? Or would this escalate into a full-blown legal battle? Stay tuned, because the fallout from Flight 347 was far from over. The story of Flight 347 had already captivated the world. The shocking mid-flight slap, the swift firing of Samantha Lowe, and the outrage that followed had turned a single moment into an international scandal. But just when everyone thought they understood what had happened, the passenger at the center of it all, Ethan Carter, finally spoke out. And what he revealed changed everything. For days, Ethan had stayed silent. He had refused interview requests and avoided the media frenzy. But behind closed doors, he was struggling to make sense of what had happened. At first, he thought that letting the airline handle it was enough. They fired Samantha almost immediately. The company had even reached out to him privately, offering a formal apology and promising to ensure this never happens again. And yet, despite all of that, something didn't sit right with him. Everywhere he turned, the narrative had already been written. Heroic airline acts fast to protect passengers from violent flight attendant. Passenger slapped mid-flight. Flight attendant fired on the spot. Zero tolerance. Airline refuses to back down after shocking assault. The public had reacted with fury. Samantha was condemned. Some called her dangerous, while others said she was lucky to have just lost her job instead of being arrested. But the more Ethan watched the headlines, the more he felt the weight of a story that didn't quite match reality, because he knew something no one else did. The slap wasn't the whole story, and now it was time to tell the truth. When Ethan finally agreed to an interview, the world was listening. Sitting in front of the cameras, his expression was serious but calm. "I want to be clear," he said, his voice steady. "I didn't expect this to go viral. I never wanted anyone to lose their job." The reporter nodded, urging him to continue. What happened on that plane, it wasn't just about the slap. I need people to understand that. For the first time, he shared his experience in detail, and the picture he painted was far more complicated than anyone had expected. Ethan described how the incident had started long before Samantha lost control. It had begun as a simple seat request. "My assigned seat had an issue," he explained. "Something was wrong with the recliner. It wasn't working properly. I didn't think it was a big deal, so I asked one of the flight attendants if I could switch." That flight attendant had been Samantha Lowe. "She didn't take it well," he admitted, shifting slightly in his chair. "I don't know if she was having a bad day or if I said something wrong, but she was cold, almost dismissive. She told me I had to stay in my seat, no exceptions." At first he let it go, but as the flight continued, his seat became more uncomfortable, and he saw other passengers being moved without issue. So he asked again, and this time Samantha snapped. "She rolled her eyes at me," he said, a hint of pain in his voice. "Told me I was being difficult and that she didn't have time for this. I wasn't rude, I wasn't yelling. I was just trying to figure out why I was being treated differently from the other passengers." He paused, his fingers tightening into a fist. "But the way she looked at me, it was like I was beneath her." Ethan admitted that her reaction hurt him more than he expected. He was a man who prided himself on staying calm, on keeping his emotions in check. But in that moment, he felt humiliated. It wasn't just about the seat. It was about being dismissed, being made to feel powerless. So for the first time, he raised his voice. "I told her flat out that I wanted to speak to her supervisor." Her face darkened. She said, "Sir, I am the authority on this plane. There's no one else to speak to." It was in that moment, that single exchange, that everything changed. Ethan had been about to sit back down when Samantha leaned in close, her voice low but sharp. She said, "If you don't like it, you can leave the plane." His heart pounded. She knew I couldn't leave. We were already in the air, but she said it anyway, like I didn't belong there. The words had stung more than he wanted to admit. And then, when he responded, when he tried one last time to stand his ground, she lost control, and she slapped him. The sound had echoed through the cabin. Ethan had been too shocked to react at first. For a moment, the whole plane went silent. Passengers had stared in horror. The flight attendants had rushed to contain the situation. And Samantha, as if realizing what she had done too late, had stepped back, her hands shaking. "I didn't move," he admitted, "not because I was scared, but because I was processing, trying to understand how we got to that point." That moment had changed everything. And yet, Ethan's biggest regret was that it had come to this at all. Ethan's revelations flipped the public perception upside down. Samantha had been stressed. Samantha had been overworked. But Samantha had also crossed a line. And suddenly the public was divided all over again. Some doubled down on defending her, blaming the airline for pushing her to that breaking point. Others felt betrayed, realizing that the passenger wasn't the aggressor they had assumed he was. And just like that, the world wasn't sure what to believe anymore. Ethan's interview left the world with more questions than answers. Should Samantha be given a second chance? Should the airline be held responsible for its toxic culture? Or was Samantha's firing the only way to send a message that violence, no matter the reason, is unacceptable? Whatever the truth, one thing was certain. This story was far from over. And now the fight for justice had only just begun. Who do you think was in the wrong? Do you support Samantha, or do you think the airline made the right decision? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories just like this. The moment Samantha Lowe stepped off Flight 347, her entire world unraveled. She had walked onto that plane as a respected flight attendant, known for her professionalism and dedication. She walked off as a disgraced employee, fired without hesitation. Her name splashed across headlines, condemned by thousands who didn't even know her. But what no one saw was what came after. What happens when your entire life falls apart in the span of minutes? This is the story of what happened to Samantha Lowe. After the slap, after the firing, after the world turned its back on her. And by the end of this, you might question everything you thought you knew about her. As she stepped into the airport terminal, every eye seemed to be on her. Passengers whispered, flight attendants averted their gazes, and security officers stood close by, watching her like she was a criminal. She felt naked under their stares, exposed, ashamed. And then, her phone buzzed. It was a message from her airline supervisor. You will receive your termination notice within the next 24 hours. Please do not report to work. That was it. No discussion, no defense. No second chances. She had spent years building her career. She had sacrificed holidays, missed family events, worked 12-hour flights with little rest, and it was gone. Just like that. As she made her way through the airport, her hands trembled. What was she supposed to do now? The news spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with outrage. Unhinged flight attendant attacks passenger. Fired on the spot. Passenger tells his side of the story. He never deserved what happened. Airline takes swift action. Flight attendant terminated immediately. People didn't just condemn her. They mocked her. They attacked her. They picked apart her entire existence. They called her unprofessional. They called her unstable. Some even called her dangerous. And Samantha? She stopped checking her phone up front because every time she did, she saw another person tearing her apart. The worst part? None of them knew the truth. What the headlines didn't mention was that Samantha had been working under extreme pressure for months. That flight, Flight 347, was her fourth back-to-back shift. She had been on duty for almost 16 hours with barely a break. Her airline had been short-staffed, forcing flight attendants to pick up extra shifts or risk losing hours. And she hadn't been sleeping. Her schedule had been relentless. City after city, time zone after time zone, barely any time to breathe. Samantha wasn't a bad employee. She was a human being pushed to her breaking point. And Flight 347 was the moment she finally cracked. The airline industry thrives on perfection. Flight attendants are expected to smile through everything. Exhaustion, smile. Passengers yelling at you, smile. Personal problems? Leave them at the door and smile. But what happens when the pressure is too much? What happens when you're exhausted, stressed, and overwhelmed, and no one cares? Samantha found out the hard way. She had spent years biting her tongue, bottling up frustration, pretending everything was fine, until one moment of weakness, one uncontrolled reaction, cost her everything. And the world never stopped to ask why. In the days after her firing, Samantha disappeared from public view. She stayed inside. She didn't answer her phone. She ignored the emails from journalists begging for an interview. She barely left her bed. Because what was left, her career was gone. Her reputation was destroyed. And no one wanted to hear her side of the story. The same airline that once praised her for handling difficult passengers had now erased her from existence. They didn't care about the long hours, the mental exhaustion, the lack of support. They just needed someone to blame. And Samantha was the perfect scapegoat. As time passed, something unexpected happened. Some people started to question the narrative. People asked, why did the airline fire her so fast? Without an investigation? If she was so unstable, why did she have years of spotless performance reviews? Should we be blaming her or the system that pushed her to the edge? Slowly, the conversation began to shift. Maybe this wasn't just about one flight attendant losing control. Maybe this was about an industry that treats its workers like machines until they break. Samantha's story is not unique. There are thousands of airline workers pushed to the edge, dealing with exhaustion, verbal abuse from passengers, unfair working conditions, And the moment they slip up, they are discarded like they never mattered. So now we ask you, the listeners, do you think Samantha deserved this? Do you believe the airline should have investigated first? Or do you think this is proof that the airline industry needs serious change? Let us know in the comments below. And if you believe that workers deserve better treatment, like this story to show your support, because Samantha may have been the first flight attendant to break under pressure. But if nothing changes, she won't be the last. At 30,000 feet in the air, passengers relax, sip their drinks, and flip through movies, blissfully unaware of the silent battle being fought just beyond the curtain. Behind every polished uniform, behind every forced smile, behind every, "Can I get you something to drink?" there's a story of exhaustion, a story of burnout, a story of an industry that demands perfection while ignoring the suffering of its workers. This is the truth the airlines won't tell you. From the outside, being a flight attendant looks glamorous. Travel the world, wear a polished uniform, visit exciting destinations. But what the airline ads don't show is the exhaustion, the mental strain, the pressure to always be perfect, no matter how broken you feel inside. People see the smiles, but not the sleepless nights. People see the politeness, but not the anxiety underneath it. People see the service, but not the sacrifice. And for years, flight attendants have been pushed to their limits, suffering in silence. Until one day, one slap forced the world to finally pay attention. Flight attendants are trained to handle anything. Passengers yelling at them, emergencies at 35,000 feet, working 12-plus hour shifts with barely a break. But there's one thing they're never taught how to handle. What happens when they need help? Because in the airline industry, flight attendants are not allowed to break down. They're not allowed to be tired. They're not allowed to be overwhelmed. They're not allowed to have a bad day. If they do, they risk losing their jobs. So they push through, they swallow their exhaustion. They keep smiling, even when they're falling apart inside. And the airlines, they don't care. What most passengers don't realize is that flight attendants often work back-to-back flights with barely any rest. A typical schedule might look like this. Day 1, wake up at 3 a.m., work 3 flights, land at midnight. Day 2, 4 hours of sleep, another 3 flights. Day 3, delays, cancellations, and passengers who take out their frustration on the crew. Day 4, another overnight shift running on fumes. By the end of the week, they've been on their feet for over 60 hours with no guaranteed time off to recover. Many airlines intentionally schedule crews like this, knowing full well that it pushes them to exhaustion. And when flight attendants finally break, the airline fires them and replaces them with someone new. Because to the airline industry, employees are replaceable. But the exhaustion isn't the only problem. Being a flight attendant means dealing with verbal abuse from passengers, unwanted advances in harassment, medical emergencies, fears of mid-air disasters. And yet, no one checks on them. After a flight where a passenger screams in their face, the airline expects them to move on. After a medical emergency where a passenger collapses, they're told to continue like nothing happened. After being grabbed, harassed, and treated like objects, they're given no protection. It's trauma after trauma, with no time to process any of it. Because to the airlines, there's no room for emotions. You smile, you serve, you move on. But no one can hold it together forever. And on Flight 347, a flight attendant finally snapped. When Samantha Lowe slapped a passenger, it wasn't just a moment of anger. It was a breaking point. It was the result of years of pressure, exhaustion, and mistreatment. But instead of asking why it happened, the world only cared about punishing her. The airline immediately fired her, without investigating. Passengers judged her, without knowing her story. Social media destroyed her, without understanding what led to that moment. No one asked, why was she so stressed? Was she working too many hours? Was she struggling with exhaustion? Because to them, she was just another flight attendant. And flight attendants are expected to be perfect, even when they're barely holding on. The airline industry thrives on pushing workers to their limits. They promise travel perks, exciting careers, a chance to see the world. But they don't tell you about the extreme burnout, the lack of mental health support, the dangerous schedules. Flight attendants should not be treated as disposable. They should have fair work hours, mental health resources, time to rest and recover, protection from abusive passengers. Because when workers are pushed too far, incidents like Flight 347 will keep happening, and the next time the world might not be able to ignore it. So now we ask you, the listener, do you think flight attendants deserve better conditions? Do you believe the airline industry is ignoring burnout? Should companies be held accountable for pushing workers past their breaking points? Let us know in the comments below. If you believe that flight attendants deserve better, like this story to show your support. Because this isn't just about one flight attendant. It's about every worker who has ever been treated as disposable. It's time we stop blaming the people who break under pressure and start holding accountable the system that breaks them. The world watched in shock as the airline swiftly fired Samantha Lowe, the flight attendant, at the center of the infamous Flight 347 incident. In the court of public opinion, she was already guilty, painted as an unhinged employee who had lost control mid-flight. But behind the sensational headlines, behind the viral clips, behind the corporate statements distancing the airline from her actions, there was a human being, a woman pushed to her breaking point by an industry that demands everything and gives nothing in return. Her story wasn't over, not by a long shot. In fact, the moment the airline fired her, they unknowingly set off a chain reaction that would change the industry forever. When Samantha walked out of the airline's headquarters that day, her career was over, her reputation was in ruins, and she had no idea what to do next. She had dedicated 10 years of her life to this job. She had sacrificed holidays, missed family milestones, endured long-haul flights on no sleep, all in the name of being a perfect flight attendant. And now, with one mistake, the airline had discarded her like trash. For the first few days, she barely left her apartment. She avoided social media, afraid of what people were saying about her. The messages in her inbox were a mix of support and hatred. Some passengers who had been on the flight defended her, saying that she had been visibly exhausted before the incident. But others, they weren't so kind. You deserve to be blacklisted from every airline. How did someone like you even get hired? You're a disgrace to the uniform. Each message felt like a dagger to the heart. She thought about staying silent, about accepting defeat, but then something unexpected happened. A former colleague reached out, someone she hadn't spoken to in years, a woman who had left the airline industry after suffering a mental breakdown due to overwork. Her message was simple. You're not the first to break under this pressure, Samantha, but you might be the first to actually do something about it. And just like that, Samantha knew what she had to do. 3 weeks later, Samantha walked into a law office, still unsure if she was making the right choice. She had been advised by many to just let it go, to move on and find another job. But how could she? How could she move on, knowing that the same thing would happen to someone else? How could she walk away, knowing that the airline would continue to push employees beyond their limits, only to fire them the second they cracked under pressure? She sat across from a well-dressed attorney who had already been following her case. He had seen the headlines, heard the rumors, and he didn't waste time with pleasantries. If you do this, he warned, you'll be taking on an entire industry. They'll dig into your past. They'll paint you as unstable. They'll try to make you disappear. Samantha straightened her back. Let them try, she said. And with that, the lawsuit was filed. Wrongful termination, failure to provide a safe working environment, violation of employee mental health protections. The moment the lawsuit became public, it was everywhere. The media swarmed her, talk shows invited her, and labor unions took notice. Because this wasn't just about one flight attendant who got fired. This was about every airline employee who had ever been overworked, mistreated, and discarded. Like they didn't matter. The airline wasn't going down without a fight. Their legal team immediately attacked Samantha's credibility, claiming she had a history of emotional instability. She was known for having a bad attitude toward passengers. The slap was not a result of workplace stress, but her own personal failings. They wanted the world to believe she was the problem. But then, something unexpected happened. One by one, other flight attendants started coming forward. They shared their own horror stories, being forced to work 16-hour shifts without a break, being verbally abused by passengers with no protection from management, fainting mid-flight due to exhaustion, only to be forced back to work the next day. Suddenly, Samantha's case wasn't just her case anymore. It was the case of every flight attendant who had ever been pushed too far. Labor unions rallied behind her, calling for stronger worker protections, mental health support for airline employees, a review of zero-tolerance policies that fail to account for extreme workplace stress. The narrative was changing, and the airline knew it. They had expected Samantha to disappear. Instead, she had become the face of a movement. After months of legal battles, the airline offered Samantha a settlement, a large sum of money in exchange for her silence. But Samantha refused. She didn't just want money, she wanted justice. And then, after a trial that had captivated the nation, the verdict came in. Samantha won. The court ruled that the airline had failed to account for extreme working conditions. Their zero-tolerance policy ignored the mental health of employees. They had wrongfully terminated her without considering the workplace factors that led to the incident. The decision set a precedent, forcing airlines to reevaluate their policies and implement real protections for employees. The industry had been forced to change because one woman refused to stay silent. In the end, Samantha didn't return to the airline industry. Instead, she became an advocate, fighting for better working conditions across multiple industries. Her case became a symbol of resilience. Her fight became a wake-up call. And her victory? It wasn't just for her, it was for every worker who had ever been treated as disposable. So the next time you step onto a plane, remember, the person serving you coffee might be running on 2 hours of sleep. The smile they're giving you might be hiding exhaustion. The person helping you might be fighting a battle you'll never see. Flight attendants deserve better. If you believe that, like this story to show your support. And don't forget to comment your thoughts, because their fight is far from over. When the airline fired Ava Mitchell, they thought she would disappear quietly. Just another disgraced employee, another name forgotten in the endless churn of the industry. They thought they had silenced her. But they were wrong, because Ava wasn't done fighting. Her story wasn't just about one bad day. It was about an entire workforce suffering in silence, an industry that demanded perfection from its employees while giving them nothing in return. And Ava was ready to expose it all. For years, Ava had watched flight attendants push past exhaustion, hold back tears, and suppress their pain just to keep their jobs. She had seen her colleagues faint from dehydration, break down in airport bathrooms, and work through sickness because calling out was never an option. She had witnessed passengers scream at her friends, hurling insults as though they weren't even human, just servants in the sky, expected to endure abuse with a smile. And worst of all, she had seen the airline ignore it all. No one cared if they were overworked. No one cared if they were mistreated. No one cared if they were on the edge of breaking. Until one day when Ava finally broke. And instead of being met with support, she was met with termination papers. But she wasn't going to let that be the end of her story. She was going to make sure the world knew the truth. A few weeks after her firing, Ava received a call from a journalist. They wanted an exclusive interview. They had seen how her story had gone viral, and they wanted to hear her side. At first, she hesitated. She knew that if she spoke out, the airline would fight back harder. They would try to discredit her, call her unstable, say she was never fit for the job in the first place. But then she thought of the other flight attendants still suffering in silence. She thought about the young girl in training, dreaming of a glamorous career, unaware that she would soon be trapped in a brutal, thankless system. She thought about the veteran flight attendants, the ones who had given decades of their lives to this job, only to be tossed aside the moment they couldn't keep up. She knew she couldn't stay silent. So she sat down, took a deep breath, and told the world everything. And when the interview aired, something incredible happened. People listened. Other flight attendants came forward, sharing their own horror stories. Passengers who had witnessed her mistreatment spoke out, saying they had seen firsthand how cruelly she had been treated. And suddenly, Ava wasn't just one woman fighting alone. She was the face of a movement. The airline panicked. They released statements, claiming that Ava's firing was justified, that they had zero tolerance for unprofessionalism. They called her disruptive, irrational, and dangerous. But this time, their words fell flat, because too many people knew the truth now. Too many flight attendants had stepped forward. Too many passengers had seen it happen. Too many workers in other industries recognized the same toxic patterns. And the more the airline attacked Ava, the more people rallied around her. Labor unions invited her to speak at events. She started getting calls from activists who wanted to use her case as a catalyst for change. Suddenly, Ava wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every worker who had ever been pushed too far. A year later, Ava walked onto a stage. The room was packed. The crowd was filled with flight attendants, nurses, teachers, retail workers, all of them tired, underpaid, undervalued. She looked out at the faces of people who had been ignored for far too long, and she spoke. She spoke about the exhaustion. She spoke about the mistreatment. She spoke about the fear of speaking up, because in so many industries, if you fight back, you lose everything. And when she finished, the room erupted into applause, because they weren't just clapping for her. They were clapping for themselves, for every moment they had swallowed their pain, for every time they had been told to just deal with it, for every battle they had fought in silence. Ava's book, Breaking Point, The Fight for Dignity in the Workplace, became a bestseller. Her story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever been treated as disposable. Ava's journey didn't end there. She continues to fight for change, speaking at conferences, rallies, and labor union meetings. She has helped pass new worker protection laws, ensuring that no one else has to experience what she did. But she can't do it alone, because this isn't just Ava's fight. This is our fight. If you believe that workers deserve better, if you believe that no one should be thrown away just for being human, then show your support. Like this story to show Ava and every worker that they are not alone. Comment below if you've ever been in a job where you felt overworked and undervalued. Share this story so more people can see the truth about how workers are treated, because this fight isn't over. And Ava's story is just the beginning. Ava Mitchell had once been just another flight attendant, waking up before dawn, putting on her uniform, and pushing through exhaustion to ensure passengers had a smooth, comfortable journey. She had given years of her life to the airline industry, working long hours with little rest, always expected to smile no matter how badly she was treated. And then, one moment changed everything. One mistake, one act of frustration had nearly destroyed her life. The airline fired her on the spot, hoping she would fade into obscurity, just another employee lost in the shuffle. But Ava didn't disappear. She refused to be forgotten. Instead, she became something no one expected, a leader, a voice for the voiceless, a fighter for change. And because of her, everything was about to shift. What started as a viral moment of shame quickly transformed into a movement. Ava's story spread like wildfire, igniting conversations far beyond the airline industry. Workers from hospitals, schools, customer service, and warehouses reached out to her, saying, "We know exactly how you feel." She wasn't just speaking for flight attendants anymore. She was speaking for every worker who had ever been told, "Just deal with it. Smile and move on. Be grateful you have a job." And Ava wasn't having it. She took her story to news outlets, exposing the toxic, high-pressure environments so many workers faced. She spoke to lawmakers, pushing for better worker protections. She even stood before executives in the airline industry, forcing them to listen to the reality of their employees' suffering. And they couldn't ignore her anymore, because she had the world watching. At first, the airline tried to downplay everything. They released a public statement saying Ava was an isolated case, that she had been emotionally unstable, that they had no choice but to fire her. But the public didn't buy it, because hundreds of other flight attendants stepped forward with their own horror stories. Stories of working 14-hour shifts with no food, stories of being harassed by passengers but told to stay professional, stories of hiding their tears in airplane bathrooms, just trying to make it to the next flight. Ava's case was no longer about her. It was about an entire industry that had ignored its workers for too long. Under immense pressure, the airline had no choice but to act. They announced new mental health resources for employees, shorter shifts and required rest breaks, zero-tolerance policies for abusive passengers, support for flight attendants dealing with stress and burnout. And other airlines took notice. Competing companies rushed to follow suit, terrified of becoming the next target of public outrage. Slowly but surely, the industry began to change. And it all started with Ava. 1 year after she lost her job, Ava was standing on a stage. The room was packed, not just with flight attendants, but with workers from all industries. She had been invited to speak at a national labor rights conference, and the audience hung on her every word. She took a deep breath and said, "I used to believe that keeping my head down and working hard would protect me. I thought that if I just did my job, nothing bad would happen. I was wrong. I learned the hard way that in too many industries, we are treated as replaceable, as if our exhaustion, our pain, our mental health doesn't matter. But we are not replaceable. We are not just numbers. We are human beings, and we deserve to be treated that way." The room erupted in applause, because every person there had felt the same way at some point in their life. Every person there had been told to suffer in silence. But now they weren't silent anymore. And Ava was leading the charge. Ava's journey teaches us all something important. 1. Never let a company define your worth. Your job is what you do, not who you are. If a company doesn't respect you, walk away or fight back. 2. Speak up, even when it's terrifying. Ava could have stayed silent. She could have let the airline win, but instead she spoke out and changed everything. 3. Protect your mental health. No job is worth sacrificing your well-being. Workplaces need to respect that. And if they don't, demand better. 4. You are not alone. No matter what industry you work in, you are not the only one struggling. There are others just like you, and together you have power. Ava's fight is still happening today. She's pushing for more laws, supporting workers, and demanding change. But she can't do it alone. Do you believe workers deserve better? Have you ever experienced burnout, stress, or mistreatment at work? Comment below and share your story. Because this isn't just Ava's story, it's all of ours. And the more we speak up, the more we force companies to listen. Like this video if you stand with Ava and every worker fighting for respect. Subscribe to the channel to hear more powerful stories like this. Together, we can create change. Together, together we can demand better. This fight is just beginning, and we need you to be a part of it.